Hey guys, tonight we journey back to a time when darkness truly ruled the night, when the setting sun transformed entire towns into quiet islands of candlelight, and when sleep arrived not because people were tired of screens or exhausted by endless notifications, but because the world itself simply disappeared into blackness. Tonight, we travel to early America, long before electricity hummed through wires, where families measured their evenings by firelight, where strange sounds echoed across wooden floors after midnight, and where people believed the hours between sleep were filled with secrets, prayers, whispers, and sometimes fear itself. So before you settle in for the night, take a moment to like the video. Subscribe to the channel if you enjoy these sleepy journeys into forgotten history. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. Now, dim the lights. Maybe leave only a small lamp glowing nearby. And let us wander slowly into the long American night before electricity existed. The winter wind pressed against the small farmhouse outside Boston in the year 1768. Snow gathered around the wooden fence posts, while smoke drifted lazily from the chimney into a dark blue evening sky. Inside the house, the Parker family moved carefully through the final chores of the day. Nathaniel Parker closed the barn doors, while his eldest son carried water from the frozen pump. His wife, Margaret, leaned over the fireplace, stirring a thick stew that smelled of onions and salted pork. The youngest children sat close to the fire, wrapped in blankets, because the warmth barely reached the corners of the room. There were no glowing bulbs hanging overhead, no humming refrigerator, no distant television noise floating from another room. Once the sun vanished, the world became dim almost immediately. The family owned only a handful of candles because wax was expensive. They could not waste light carelessly. Every flame had value. Margaret trimmed the candle wicks carefully with small iron scissors, while reminding the children not to stand too close to them. A single candle might need to last the entire evening. Nathaniel stepped inside, carrying the sharp smell of snow on his coat. He stamped his boots near the doorway and glanced toward the tiny window. Outside, darkness had already swallowed the fields. Only the moon reflected faintly across the white ground. "Storm may worsen tonight," he muttered quietly. Margaret nodded without looking up. "Then we sleep close to the fire." The children understood what that meant. During brutal winters, the family often gathered together in the main room because heating multiple rooms required more wood than they could spare. Americans before electricity did not simply move from brightly lit room to brightly lit room. Most homes contained shadows everywhere after sunset. Families naturally gathered around warmth and light because the rest of the house became cold, silent, and nearly invisible. After supper, Nathaniel opened a heavy Bible near the fireplace. Reading at night was difficult work. Candlelight flickered constantly, forcing his eyes to strain against dancing shadows. His daughter Abigail leaned close beside him, listening as he slowly recited scripture aloud. Many Americans experienced books this way. One person read while others listened because candles were too precious to waste in separate rooms. Outside, the wind continued scraping against the wooden walls. Abigail glanced nervously toward the dark staircase. "Do you hear that?" Everyone paused. For a moment, only the fire crackled softly. Then came another sound, a slow creaking from upstairs. Nathaniel calmly returned to reading. House settling in the cold, but Abigail still stared upward. Nighttime before electricity carried different emotions than modern darkness. Today, cities glow endlessly. Streetlights erase much of the night sky. But colonial Americans often lived inside nearly complete darkness after sunset. Every unfamiliar noise felt larger. Every gust of wind seemed alive. The imagination grew powerful in dim candlelight. Margaret finished mending a wool shirt while her younger boys fought sleep beside the hearth. Their daily rhythm followed the natural world closely. Most Americans rose extremely early because daylight was precious for labor. Farmers, blacksmiths, fishermen, and shopkeepers depended almost entirely on sunlight to complete their work. Once darkness arrived, productive activity slowed dramatically. Yet people did not always sleep the way modern people sleep today. Historians later discovered that many early Americans practiced what was called segmented sleep. Instead of sleeping continuously for 8 hours, families often experienced a first sleep and second sleep. They would rest for several hours after nightfall, wake sometime around midnight, remain awake quietly for a period, then return to bed until dawn. That strange rhythm unfolded naturally inside the Parker farmhouse. Around 9 o'clock, Margaret extinguished 2 candles. The room immediately shrank into darkness, except for the orange firelight. The children climbed beneath heavy blankets stuffed with feathers, while Nathaniel checked the door latch carefully. Locks mattered deeply at night, because once darkness covered the countryside, travelers, thieves, and wandering animals became almost impossible to spot. The family settled down together. Outside, snow drifted softly across the empty road. Hours passed. The fire burned lower. Then sometime deep into the night, Nathaniel's eyes opened naturally. The room remained dark, except for faint embers glowing red beneath ash. Beside him, Margaret shifted slightly awake as well. This midnight waking felt ordinary to them. Neither panicked nor wondered why they were awake. For countless people before electricity, the middle of the night often became a quiet period of reflection. Nathaniel stood carefully and added another log to the fire. Tiny sparks floated upward through the chimney. Margaret wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and whispered softly about tomorrow's weather. Sometimes families prayed during this waking period. Others spoke quietly, smoked pipes, visited neighbors, or completed small chores by candlelight. Abigail occasionally woke during these midnight hours too. She once asked her mother why people awakened in darkness. Margaret had smiled gently. Because the Lord divided the night, same as the day. Outside, distant wolves howled faintly beyond the forest. Abigail pulled her blanket tighter. Fear lived close beside sleep in early America. People carried deep superstitions about nighttime. Ghost stories traveled across villages during long winters. Travelers disappearing on isolated roads became whispered legends. Strange illnesses arriving overnight frightened entire communities because medical knowledge remained limited. Even ordinary sleep itself felt mysterious. Many Americans believed dreams carried spiritual meaning. Ministers warned that sinful thoughts might enter sleeping minds. Some families prayed intensely before bed hopping for protection from nightmares or unseen forces. Children especially feared dark corners because candlelight created moving shadows that seemed almost alive. In another part of the colonies, far south in Virginia, a young enslaved man named Isaiah experienced nights very differently. The plantation house glowed faintly with candles, while enslaved workers slept inside rough cabins beyond the fields. Isaiah lay awake, listening to insects hum outside the walls during humid summer darkness. His body ached from endless tobacco labor beneath the sun. Yet, nighttime sometimes brought the only moments of quiet freedom he possessed. He listened carefully for sounds from nearby cabins. Soft singing occasionally drifted through the darkness. Spiritual songs traveled gently across the fields after midnight. Some enslaved people whispered stories beneath the stars, while others secretly planned escapes northward. Darkness hid fear, but also possibility. Isaiah's grandmother had once told him that nighttime belonged to memory. Day belongs to masters, she whispered. Night belongs to souls. Without electricity, the night sky itself dominated human experience. Americans saw stars with astonishing clarity, unimaginable to many modern people. The Milky Way stretched brightly overhead across farms, forests, rivers, and mountains. Sailors navigated using constellations. Farmers predicted weather from moonlight. Entire communities understood seasons through the sky above them. Isaiah stepped outside quietly. The stars spread endlessly overhead. He could hear frogs near the riverbank and distant horses shifting in their stable. Somewhere far across the plantation grounds, a dog barked once before silence returned. Night carried layers of sound people rarely noticed today. Wood creaked, wind brushed trees, animals moved invisibly through darkness. Rain approaching miles away sometimes announced itself softly before arriving. People learned these sounds because silence dominated their evenings. There were no engines, electronic devices, or glowing advertisements filling the night. Back in Boston, the storm intensified around the Parker farmhouse. Abigail woke suddenly from a nightmare. She sat upright, breathing hard, while snow tapped against the windows. For one terrifying moment, She could not see anything except darkness. Then she heard her father's steady breathing nearby. The fire still glowed faintly. Slowly her fear eased, stirred awake again near dawn. This time he remained lying still beneath the blankets, while pale gray light slowly touched the windows. Americans before electricity often experienced dawn gradually. There was no sudden alarm clock buzzing loudly beside the bed. Roosters crowed. Animals moved. The horizon brightened little by little. Morning returned slowly to the frozen farm, rose first, and reignited the fire properly, while the children slept curled together beneath quilts. Stepped outside into bitter cold, carrying an axe over his shoulder. Another day had begun exactly as countless others before it, but across America, changes were already beginning. Cities like Philadelphia and New York slowly experimented with oil lamps along certain streets. Wealthier families purchased more candles imported from distant ports. Taverns stayed open later. New ideas about industry and productivity spread gradually through growing towns. The ancient relationship between darkness and human sleep would not remain unchanged forever. Still, for now, most Americans continued living according to firelight, moonlight, and the rising sun, and deep in the quiet spaces between first sleep and second sleep, millions of people lay awake, listening to the strange breathing darkness of early America itself. The wind had calmed by morning, but the world outside the Parker farmhouse remained buried beneath heavy snow. Parker moved through the frozen yard with stiff shoulders, while his boots crunched against hardened drifts. The cold entered a man slowly in New England winters, first through the fingertips, then the ears, then deep into the bones, until even simple chores felt exhausting. Yet mornings could not be wasted. Before electricity, people depended entirely on daylight, and daylight during winter disappeared quickly. Split wood beside the barn, while pale sunlight crawled across the fields. Smoke rose from neighboring chimneys in thin gray columns. Across the countryside, families were waking in similar ways. Fires needed tending. Livestock needed feeding. Water had to be carried indoors before pumps froze solid again. Life demanded movement from the moment dawn arrived. Inside the farmhouse, prepared oat porridge, while Abigail brushed ashes from the hearthstones. The younger boys still looked sleepy. Their eyes carried the heaviness of interrupted nighttime rest, though nobody considered it unusual. Most families accepted midnight waking as naturally as sunrise itself. Abigail glanced toward the window, where snow covered nearly everything outside. "Will we visit town today?" she asked. Shook her head gently. Roads too dangerous after storms. The girl sighed quietly. Winter evenings in colonial America often felt long beyond description. Once darkness returned, entertainment remained limited. Families talked, repaired clothing, played simple games, carved tools, or listened to stories repeated countless times across generations. Many children knew old tales so well they could finish entire passages before elders spoke them aloud. Still, stories mattered because they filled darkness. That afternoon, traveled briefly to a nearby neighbor's property to help free a wagon trapped in snow. Such visits formed important pieces of American nighttime culture before electricity. Communities relied heavily upon one another because isolation became dangerous after sunset. If sickness arrived or storms blocked roads, neighbors might be the only available help for miles. The men worked silently for nearly an hour before finally loosening the wagon wheels from frozen mud. As dusk approached, neighbor Thomas Reed invited him indoors for cider beside the fire. The Reed home smelled of smoke, wet wool, and roasted chestnuts. Thomas's wife sat spinning thread near candlelight, while their teenage son repaired fishing nets nearby. Shadows shifted constantly across the low ceiling. Thomas handed a steaming cup. "You hear about the Carter place?" he asked quietly. Frowned no. "Boy wandered during the night last week. Sleepwalking, they say. Found him standing barefoot near the river after midnight." The room fell silent briefly. Sleepwalking terrified many early Americans. Without electric lights, wandering outside during darkness could easily become fatal. Forests, frozen rivers, and isolated roads turned deadly almost immediately after sunset. Parents often feared nighttime more than daytime because darkness hid accidents until morning. Thomas leaned closer. His mother swears he kept speaking while asleep. What'd he say? Thomas lowered his voice further. Said someone was calling from the woods. Nathaniel drank slowly, without responding. Stories like these traveled rapidly through colonial towns during winter months. In isolated communities, rumors became evening entertainment. Strange dreams, unexplained illnesses, and nighttime accidents blended together until ordinary events gained supernatural qualities. By the time Nathaniel returned home, the sky had already darkened. Abigail hurried to open the door before cold air swallowed the room. Margaret immediately noticed frost gathering across Nathaniel's beard. "You stayed too long. Rode slow after sunset," he answered. That single sentence carried enormous meaning in 18th century America. Travel after dark remained difficult and dangerous. Most roads were little more than rough dirt paths cutting through forests or fields. Without modern lighting, travelers relied on moonlight, lanterns, or memory to navigate. A missed turn could leave someone hopelessly lost. Even wealthy Americans avoided unnecessary nighttime journeys. As supper cooked over the fire, Nathaniel shared Thomas Reed's story about the sleepwalking boy. The younger children immediately moved closer together. Abigail tried sounding brave. Maybe he only dreamed it. Margaret crossed herself softly beneath her apron. Dreams open doors sometimes. Nathaniel gave her a skeptical glance, but said nothing. Beliefs surrounding sleep varied widely across early America. European traditions mixed with Native American beliefs, African spiritual practices, and religious teachings from different Christian communities. Some people viewed dreams as warnings from God. Others believed spirits traveled during sleep. Certain communities feared witches might attack vulnerable sleepers during the night. Sleep itself remained mysterious because science understood so little about the mind. Doctors occasionally blamed bad dreams on heavy suppers or poor air circulation. Ministers warned against sinful thoughts before bed. Folk healers recommended herbs stuffed beneath pillows for protection. Entire households created nighttime rituals designed to keep danger away. Margaret herself hung dried lavender near the children's beds each winter. Her mother once claimed it prevented evil dreams. After supper, Nathaniel sharpened tools beside the fire, while Abigail read aloud from a small borrowed book. Candlelight flickered weakly across the pages. Reading remained slow work because eyes strained constantly in dim illumination. Outside, darkness settled completely across the countryside. The family listened to the sounds surrounding the house. Branches scratching the roof, wind pressing gently against shutters, horses shifting inside the stable. Then somewhere far away, a church bell rang once through the night. Abigail looked up immediately. Why ring the bell now? Nathaniel paused while sharpening the blade. Probably someone passed away. Death visited colonial America often. Disease spread rapidly through towns where medicine remained primitive. Winter especially carried danger. Fevers, infections, and freezing temperatures killed many people before adulthood. As a result, nighttime bells frequently announced tragedy. Silence followed after the distant bell faded. Margaret quietly extinguished another candle to save wax. Darkness thickened around the room. Americans before electricity became deeply familiar with darkness in ways modern people rarely experience. Today, even nighttime contains constant glowing light from phones, street lamps, vehicles, and buildings. But colonial nights could become nearly absolute blackness once candles disappeared. Children learned to navigate homes by memory alone. Adults recognized family members through footsteps. People developed sharper awareness of sound because vision failed them so often after sunset. Later that evening, Abigail climbed the narrow staircase, carrying a candle carefully cupped in her hand. The flame trembled with each movement. Upstairs bedrooms remained bitterly cold during winter, and frost decorated the corners of the windows like white spider webs. She placed the candle beside her bed and listened. The house below creaked softly. Her brothers whispered downstairs near the fire. Outside, wind moved through bare trees with a long, hollow sound. Abigail sometimes wondered what nighttime looked like in cities. Nathaniel once visited Philadelphia years earlier and described streets filled with taverns, lanterns, and crowded evening noise. To Abigail, such places sounded almost magical compared to the isolated farm. Yet even cities remained dark by modern standards. In Philadelphia, during the late 18th century, only certain streets contained lamps, and those lamps often burned dimly. Wealthy neighborhoods enjoyed better lighting, while poorer districts disappeared almost entirely into shadow. Criminals, thieves, and wandering drunks thrived after midnight because visibility remained terrible. Night watchmen walked city streets carrying lanterns and wooden clubs while calling out the hours aloud. Past midnight and all is well. Their voices echoed through sleeping neighborhoods. Far south in Charleston, South Carolina, another young woman named Eleanor Finch sat awake inside her family's large townhouse, while servants extinguished lamps one by one downstairs. Her father owned a successful shipping business, making the Finch household wealthier than most Americans. Yet, even wealth could not fully defeat darkness before electricity. Eleanor stared from her bedroom window toward the harbor. Moonlight reflected across black water where ships rested silently at anchor. During daytime, the port exploded with noise, merchants, sailors, horses, and shouting dockworkers. But nighttime transformed everything. The city became slower, quieter, and more uncertain. Eleanor secretly enjoyed those hours. Her family believed respectable young women should sleep early and rise early. But Eleanor loved reading forbidden novels late into the night by candlelight. She hid extra candles beneath loose floorboards because her father complained constantly about expense. People waste light like fools, he often said. And he was correct. Before electricity, artificial light required labor. Candles came from animal fat or beeswax. Oil lamps depended on whale oil or other costly fuels. Every glowing flame represented money, effort, and resources. Most ordinary Americans, therefore, structured their lives around natural light, rather than forcing brightness into darkness. Eleanor opened her hidden book carefully. The tiny flame beside her illuminated only part of the room. Beyond the candlelight, shadows covered everything else. As she read, she heard distant footsteps below, then another sound, a slow knock at the front door downstairs. Eleanor froze immediately. Nobody respectable visited homes this late. She heard servants whispering nervously, while her father moved toward the entrance, holding a lantern. Another knock echoed through the silent house. For families before electricity, unexpected nighttime visitors often triggered fear. Darkness concealed intentions. A stranger arriving after midnight might carry terrible news, request urgent help, or pose genuine danger. Eleanor crept quietly toward the staircase. Below, her father opened the door cautiously. Cold air swept inside. A man's nervous voice answered from outside, then heard only one clear sentence. "There's been a fire near the harbor." Suddenly, the entire house awakened. Candles flared alive downstairs. Servants rushed through corridors. Her father grabbed boots and coat while shouting instructions. Fire represented one of the greatest nighttime fears in pre-electric America. Wooden towns, illuminated by candles and fireplaces, burned terrifyingly fast. Entire communities sometimes vanished before dawn because darkness delayed response efforts. Hurried toward the window again, far across Charleston's harbor district. An orange glow had already begun rising into the night sky, and across America, thousands of sleeping families remained only one spark away from disaster in the long dark world before electricity. The orange glow above Charleston's harbor spread wider with every passing minute. Finch stood near her bedroom window, clutching her shawl tightly around her shoulders, while smoke climbed into the winter sky. Even from several streets away, she could hear distant shouting echoing across the sleeping city. Her father hurried downstairs, fastening his heavy coat. "Stay inside," he warned sharply before stepping into the darkness with a lantern swinging beside him. The front door slammed shut behind him, remained frozen near the staircase, listening to the sudden chaos outside. Horses galloped over cobblestones. Men shouted warnings between buildings. Church bells rang wildly across the harbor district. Fire at night terrified early Americans more than almost anything else. Most towns consisted largely of wooden structures packed closely together. Candles, fireplaces, kitchen stoves, and oil lamps surrounded families every evening. One overturned lantern or forgotten ember could destroy entire streets before sunrise. Without electric alarms or modern fire departments, communities depended on buckets, hand pumps, and desperate human effort. Mother appeared beside her, carrying another candle. "Come away from the window," but could not stop staring at the growing glow in the distance. The harbor looked almost unreal beneath the firelight. Black ships floated against flickering orange reflections, while smoke rolled across rooftops like storm clouds. Somewhere people were dragging barrels, carrying water, screaming for help, and praying their homes would survive until morning. Night transformed disasters into something far more frightening. Across town, sailors raced through narrow streets toward the docks, while tavern owners banged on doors to wake sleeping neighbors. Families stumbled from their beds, half-dressed, clutching children beneath blankets. Some people rushed toward the flames to help. Others fled immediately, terrified the blaze would spread. An elderly watchman shouted himself hoarse, trying to organize bucket lines. "Move faster, faster." But darkness slowed everything. Lanterns swayed wildly in trembling hands. Smoke reduced visibility further. Confusion spread quickly because nobody could clearly see how large the fire had become. For Americans before electricity, nighttime emergencies often carried a dreamlike confusion. Shadows distorted reality. Panic traveled faster than accurate information. Entire neighborhoods sometimes believed cities were collapsing, when only a few buildings actually burned. Younger brother Thomas suddenly appeared, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Is the city burning?" Their mother pulled him close immediately. "No, only the docks." But uncertainty remained visible across her face. Hours passed slowly. The fire eventually stopped spreading near dawn, after workers demolished several nearby warehouses to create a gap between buildings. Exhausted men returned home blackened with soot, while church bells finally fell silent across Charleston. Father came home just as pale morning light touched the windows. He smelled strongly of smoke. "3 warehouses gone," he muttered while removing gloves. "Lost half the harbor if the wind shifted." He sat heavily beside the fireplace while servants prepared coffee. Nobody returned to sleep. That exhaustion formed another important part of life before electricity. Nighttime disasters interrupted entire communities because there were few organized emergency systems. Fires, storms, sickness, or unexpected travelers could keep households awake until dawn. And once morning arrived, daily labor still continued. Across early America, millions of people lived with chronic tiredness shaped entirely by natural conditions. Farmers woke before sunrise regardless of how poorly they had slept. Sailors worked through storms. Mothers cared for infants beneath candlelight. Travelers endured miserable roads at all hours. Modern schedules barely existed for ordinary people. Instead, life flowed according to weather, seasons, animals, and sunlight. Far north in the forests of Pennsylvania, a trapper named Samuel Holt experienced sleep differently from nearly everyone living in crowded towns. Samuel spent much of the year alone in wilderness cabins miles from settlements. His nearest neighbor sometimes lived 2 days away by horseback. Winter nights in the forest stretched endlessly. Samuel's cabin stood beside a frozen creek surrounded by towering pine trees. Snow covered the roof heavily, while animal pelts hung drying near the fireplace. Inside, the room smelled of smoke, leather, and damp wool. He sat sharpening a knife beside dim firelight, while wind moved through the trees outside. The sounds of wilderness at night unsettled, even experienced. Branches cracked suddenly without warning. Coyotes screamed in the distance. Owls called through darkness. Sometimes Samuel awoke, convinced someone stood outside the cabin, only to discover nothing except moonlight and drifting snow. Isolation affected the human mind strangely. Without artificial light or constant conversation, people became deeply aware of silence. Many Americans living on the frontier described nighttime as emotionally heavy. Long darkness forced individuals alone with their thoughts in ways modern life rarely allows. Samuel occasionally spoke aloud simply to hear another voice. That evening, He checked the cabin door twice before finally lying beneath thick blankets near the dying fire. His rifle rested beside the bed, within easy reach. Frontier settlers feared raids, wild animals, thieves, and wandering strangers. Darkness concealed threats too effectively to ignore. Outside, snow began falling again. Samuel closed his eyes slowly. Then sometime later, he woke abruptly. No sound, no obvious danger, just sudden awareness. The fire had nearly vanished, leaving only faint, glowing embers. For several long seconds, he listened carefully. Nothing, yet an uneasy feeling remained. Many early Americans believed nighttime intuition carried meaning. Hunters trusted instincts developed through years in dangerous environments. Mothers claimed they could sense illness before symptoms appeared. Sailors feared certain dreams before storms. Samuel reached for the rifle quietly. Then he heard it, footsteps crunching slowly through snow outside. He sat upright immediately. Another step, then silence again. Samuel moved carefully toward the window while keeping the rifle ready. Moonlight reflected weakly across the clearing beyond the cabin. At first, he saw nothing. Then finally, a shape emerged near the trees. A horse, and beside it, a man barely standing upright. Samuel opened the door cautiously. Cold air burst inside the cabin. The stranger stumbled forward, exhausted, his beard covered in ice. "Please," the man whispered weakly. "Been lost since sunset." Samuel guided him quickly inside before the cold finished killing him. Such encounters happened more often than modern people realize. Travelers frequently became stranded after dark because roads vanished beneath snow, storms erased landmarks, or lanterns failed. Inns remained sparse across much of America, forcing strangers to depend heavily on hospitality. The exhausted traveler introduced himself as Daniel Mercer, a merchant attempting to reach Philadelphia before winter worsened. Samuel handed him hot stew while studying the man carefully. "You rode through forest after dark." Daniel nodded shakily. "My lantern blew out hours ago." Samuel frowned. "Foolish thing." Daniel gave a tired laugh. "I know that now." They sat quietly near the fire while wind battered the cabin walls. Outside, darkness pressed endlessly against the small, glowing room. After some time, Daniel spoke again. "Strangest thing happened before I found this place." Samuel glanced upward. "What thing?" Daniel stared into the flames. "I thought I saw lights moving through the trees." Samuel remained silent. "Lanterns, maybe," Daniel continued softly. 3 or 4 of them drifting between the snow. "Probably moonlight." Daniel shook his head slowly. They moved too carefully. Stories about mysterious lights filled early American folklore. Swamps, forests, and isolated roads produced countless tales of ghost lanterns, wandering spirits, or phantom travelers. Some explanations likely came from natural gases or distant campfires distorted by weather. Others emerged from fear and imagination shaped by deep darkness. But lonely travelers remembered such experiences vividly. Samuel finally tossed another log onto the fire. "Forest plays tricks at night," he muttered. Daniel looked unconvinced. The two men eventually slept in uneasy silence, while snow continued falling outside. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away in New York City, nighttime life had already begun changing faster than anywhere else in the colonies. The city remained noisy long after sunset. Taverns overflowed with sailors, merchants, laborers, and gamblers. Street vendors sold hot food beneath smoky lanterns, while musicians played inside crowded alehouses. Wealthy citizens attended late gatherings, illuminated by dozens of candles at once. Yet darkness still controlled much of the city. Beyond the busiest streets, poor neighborhoods disappeared into dangerous shadow after midnight. Crime increased sharply during nighttime hours because visibility remained terrible. Pickpockets, thieves, and gangs moved confidently through unlit alleys. City watchmen carried bells, lanterns, and clubs, while patrolling slowly through darkness. Most citizens distrusted them completely. One young printer named Benjamin Reeves often worked late beside candlelight producing newspapers through the night. Printing presses operated by hand, requiring exhausting labor hour after hour. Benjamin's fingers remained stained black with ink nearly every day of his life. He hated nighttime work. Candles filled the print shop with thick, smoky air, while his eyes burned constantly from reading tiny letters in weak light. Yet newspapers needed completion before dawn, so riders could distribute them across the city. One freezing night, Benjamin stepped outside briefly for fresh air. Snow drifted softly between buildings. Somewhere nearby, a drunk man sang badly while stumbling down the street. Farther away, church bells announced 2 o'clock in the morning. Benjamin stared upward. Even inside America's growing cities, stars still remained visible above the rooftops. That ancient sky watched over sleepless farmers, exhausted mothers, lonely travelers, frightened children, sailors, slaves, merchants, and watchmen alike. And everywhere across the colonies, people continued surrendering themselves each night to darkness that modern humans can barely imagine anymore. Benjamin Reeves remained outside the print shop longer than he intended. Snowflakes drifted lazily through the narrow New York street, while weak lanterns flickered above distant doorways. The city smelled of wet wood, horse manure, chimney smoke, and the salty harbor beyond the docks. Even at 2 in the morning, life had not fully disappeared. A wagon rattled somewhere nearby. Voices echoed drunkenly from a tavern. Then silence swallowed everything again. Benjamin pulled his coat tighter against the cold and rubbed his tired eyes. Night work slowly damaged people in those years. Candle smoke irritated lungs, dim light strained vision constantly. Printers, tailors, bakers, tavern workers, and sailors often developed permanent exhaustion from working after sunset. Yet cities demanded labor deep into the night because commerce never truly stopped anymore. That was one of the first great changes spreading through America. For centuries, darkness naturally ended most human activity, but growing towns slowly resisted the old rhythm. Merchants wanted longer business hours. Newspapers needed faster printing. Taverns attracted customers late into the evening. Ship captains unloaded cargo overnight to save time. The battle against darkness had already begun long before electricity arrived. Benjamin stepped back inside the print shop, where the warmth felt thick and suffocating. Two apprentices worked silently beside the press, while melted candle wax hardened across wooden tables. The youngest apprentice, only 14 years old, yawned repeatedly while sorting metal letters into trays. "You'll sleep standing soon," Benjamin muttered. The boy smiled weakly. Already nearly there, Benjamin handed him a cup of watered ale. Coffee existed in colonial America, but many ordinary workers relied on ale, cider, or tea to stay awake, because clean drinking water was not always reliable. Long nighttime labor, therefore, carried strange habits modern people might barely recognize. The printing press groaned again. Outside, snow continued falling. Benjamin suddenly remembered his childhood in rural Connecticut before he moved to New York. Nights there had felt entirely different. Once candles were extinguished, the world vanished into stillness, so complete it almost frightened him. But city darkness carried constant movement hidden beneath shadows. Sometimes Benjamin missed true silence. Near dawn, the apprentices finally finished stacking fresh newspapers. Benjamin opened one carefully, while ink still dried across the page. Headlines spoke of shipping delays, winter storms, political arguments, and a recent robbery near the docks. Crime frightened urban Americans deeply after sunset. Without electric lighting, thieves operated easily through dark streets. Travelers carried lanterns partly to avoid accidents, but also to discourage attacks. Wealthier citizens often hired servants or guards to accompany them home after evening gatherings. Benjamin himself had once been robbed returning from work. 3 men emerged suddenly from an alley, their faces invisible beneath hats and darkness. He surrendered his coins immediately, because fighting in unlit streets often ended with bodies dumped quietly into harbors by morning. He never walked unarmed afterward. As pale light slowly touched the city rooftops, Benjamin extinguished the final candle in the shop. The tiny room instantly changed. Dawn revealed details hidden all night: cracked walls, ink stains, exhausted faces, and piles of unfinished work. Artificial light before electricity always remained weak compared to morning itself. That difference shaped human psychology for generations. People understood deeply that daylight represented safety, productivity, clarity, and order. Night represented uncertainty. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles south in Virginia, Isaiah woke before sunrise inside the cramped plantation cabin. Frost clung to the edges of the small window, while several other men still slept nearby beneath rough blankets. The room smelled of smoke and damp earth. Isaiah sat quietly listening to the sounds outside. Roosters beginning to crow, chains rattling faintly near storage sheds, wind brushing frozen fields. Then finally, the distant horn calling workers toward another day. Plantation schedules followed sunlight with brutal precision. Enslaved workers labored from dawn until darkness made work impossible. During harvest seasons, some owners pushed people even farther, using moonlight or torches to extend labor into the night. Sleep became precious. Isaiah's grandmother, Ruth, still slept beside the fireplace corner despite her age and failing health. She opened her eyes slowly as he prepared to leave. "You dreamed again," she whispered. Isaiah paused. "How you know? You talk in your sleep." He looked away quietly. Dreams carried enormous importance among enslaved communities. Stories, spiritual beliefs, and memories traveled across generations through nighttime conversations inside cabins after labor ended. Some people believed ancestors visited through dreams. Others searched dreams for signs of escape, survival, or warning. Ruth motioned him closer. "What do you see?" Isaiah hesitated. "A river," he finally answered. "Wide river full of stars." She nodded slowly, like the image carried hidden meaning. "Stars guide people," she whispered. Then the morning horn sounded again, outside. Isaiah stepped into the freezing darkness before dawn, while hundreds of others moved silently toward the fields. Their breath rose white in the cold air. Above them, the stars still remained visible. For millions of Americans before electricity, waking often happened before sunrise itself. People began moving through darkness, using lanterns, moonlight, or memory, because daylight hours were too valuable to waste. The modern idea of brightly lit mornings inside warm homes barely existed for ordinary people. At the same time in Pennsylvania, Samuel Holt and the stranded traveler Daniel Mercer prepared breakfast beside the cabin fire, while snowstorms continued outside. Daniel looked far healthier after several hours near warmth. "You saved my life," he admitted quietly. Samuel shrugged, "Just gave shelter." Daniel studied the rough cabin walls. "Don't you tire of this loneliness?" Samuel considered the question carefully. Frontier life demanded unusual mental strength. Families often spent months isolated from large communities. Long winters trapped people indoors with limited company, while darkness consumed enormous portions of each day. Yet many settlers preferred wilderness silence overcrowded cities. Sometimes, Samuel answered finally, but towns got noises worse than wolves. Daniel laughed softly. Fair enough. They spent much of the day repairing harness straps and clearing snow from around the cabin. Outside, the forest remained beautiful but unsettling. Tall pines blocked much of the weak winter sunlight, creating endless shadows between trees. By afternoon, Daniel spoke again about the mysterious lights he believed he saw during the night. Samuel continued chopping wood. You sure you weren't freezing half to death? Daniel frowned. I know what moonlight looks like. Samuel tossed another log aside. Old frontier stories often centered around unexplained nighttime lights. Native American legends, European folklore, and isolated settler experiences blended together into strange regional myths. Hunters described glowing shapes drifting across swamps. Travelers swore lanterns floated through forests without visible people carrying them. Most stories probably came from exhaustion, fear, weather distortions, or imagination. But people living in darkness accepted mystery more easily than modern society often does. Daniel lowered his voice slightly. My grandfather once told me certain spirits wander crossroads after midnight. Samuel snorted. Your grandfather drank too much. Still, later that evening, when darkness returned outside the cabin, Samuel found himself checking the forest more carefully than usual. Night always influenced the imagination. Back in Boston, Abigail Parker experienced another difficult winter evening inside the farmhouse. Snowstorms had prevented travel for nearly a week now, leaving the family isolated from town. The younger boys had grown restless from remaining indoors so long. Nathaniel attempted repairing a broken chair beside the fireplace, while Margaret rationed candles carefully. We've used too many already, she warned. Nathaniel sighed. Storms keep days darker. That practical problem shaped winter life constantly before electricity. Cloudy weather reduced available daylight dramatically, forcing families to burn more candles or oil earlier in the evening. Poor households often endured near darkness to save money. Abigail sat quietly sewing near the firelight. Then suddenly, her youngest brother spoke. Tell the story again. Margaret smiled faintly. Which one? The man who slept 20 years. Nathaniel groaned immediately. Not that foolish tale. But the children begged eagerly. Finally, Margaret began speaking softly, while shadows moved across the room. The story concerned a wandering man who supposedly entered the mountains before the American Revolution and awoke decades later after sleeping beneath a strange enchantment. Tales like these circulated widely through colonial America, long before Washington Irving later popularized similar legends. Stories about sleep fascinated people deeply. Nightmares, long sleeps, prophetic dreams, sleepwalking, and mysterious awakenings appeared constantly in folklore because sleep itself remained poorly understood. As Margaret continued the tale, Abigail noticed darkness pressing harder against the windows. Snow blew sideways outside, while the fire crackled warmly inside. For one brief moment, the farmhouse felt safe. Then came the sound. 3 slow knocks against the front door. Everyone froze instantly. Nathaniel stood carefully, without speaking. Another knock echoed through the house. Outside, beyond the thin wooden walls, night waited silently in the storm. The room remained perfectly still after the second knock. Only the fire continued crackling softly beneath the tension spreading across the farmhouse. Abigail felt her stomach tighten, while her younger brothers moved instinctively closer to Margaret. Outside, wind carried snow against the walls with a dry scraping sound. Nathaniel stared toward the door without moving. Visitors after dark were rare enough in winter. Visitors during storms were worse. A third knock came slowly. Not loud, not desperate, just deliberate. Nathaniel finally reached for the lantern hanging beside the fireplace. The weak flame illuminated only part of the room, while long shadows stretched across the floorboards. "Stay back," he muttered quietly. Margaret pulled the children closer as Nathaniel approached the entrance carefully. In early America, families treated nighttime knocks seriously because darkness concealed identity. A traveler could require urgent help. But thieves sometimes used storms and isolation to test homes before robberies. Nathaniel lifted the wooden bar, securing the door. Cold air burst inside immediately. A woman stood outside, beneath the snow. Her cloak was nearly white from drifting flakes, and beside her waited a small horse pulling a narrow cart. For several seconds, she said nothing, as if exhausted beyond speech. Then finally she spoke. "Please forgive the hour. My wheel broke near the road." Nathaniel studied her carefully. She appeared older than Margaret, perhaps 50, though harsh, whether made age difficult to judge. A lantern hung from the cart beside several covered bundles. Margaret stepped closer once she realized the stranger was alone. "You'd better come inside before you freeze." The woman entered slowly, while snow melted across the floor beneath her boots. Warmth from the fireplace immediately fogged the air around her cloak. "My name is Lydia Whitmore," she said softly. "I was trying to reach Concord before the storm worsened." Nathaniel closed the door firmly behind her. "Roads are dangerous tonight." "I know that now," Lydia answered with a tired smile. Travel before electricity depended heavily on daylight and weather conditions. Most Americans avoided long journeys during winter unless absolutely necessary. Roads vanished beneath snow, bridges became icy death traps, and lantern light rarely illuminated far enough ahead to travel safely after sunset. Still, emergencies forced people onto the roads constantly. Margaret offered Lydia hot stew, while Nathaniel examined the broken wheel outside beneath lantern light. Abigail watched the stranger carefully from across the room. Something about Lydia seemed unusual. Not frightening exactly, just distant somehow. The older woman warmed her hands near the fire. "You've kind children," she said quietly. Margaret smiled. Most days. The younger boys relaxed quickly once food appeared. Soon they bombarded Lydia with questions about travel, towns, and distant places beyond Boston. Have you seen the ocean? Did robbers ever chase you? Do wolves really attack wagons? Lydia answered patiently, while shadows flickered across her face. Yes, I've seen the ocean many times. No robbers yet. And wolves usually fear noise more than people. Nathaniel eventually returned, inside, shaking snow from his coat. "Will won't be fixed tonight," he announced. "Storm too heavy." Lydia nodded gratefully. "I'll leave at first light." Such hospitality formed an essential part of survival in early America. Inns remained scattered across many regions, and travelers frequently depended on strangers for shelter during storms. Refusing help could easily mean condemning someone to death from exposure. Still, inviting strangers indoors carried risks. Nathaniel kept his rifle nearby, even while speaking politely. As evening deepened, Lydia removed a small cloth bundle from her cart and revealed several beeswax candles. Margaret's eyes widened slightly at the sight. Beeswax burned cleaner and brighter than ordinary tallow candles, making them valuable luxuries in many households. "A gift for your kindness," Lydia said. Margaret hesitated. "These are too precious." "Not compared to warmth." Nathaniel accepted reluctantly. Soon one of the beeswax candles burned beside the fireplace, filling the room with soft golden light and a faint, sweet scent. Even the children noticed the difference immediately. "It's brighter," Abigail whispered. Lydia smiled faintly. Good candles change a room. That simple observation reflected enormous truth about life before electricity. Artificial lighting shaped mood, productivity, and social life deeply. Wealthier Americans could afford brighter evenings through better candles and oil lamps. Poor families often sat in near darkness once sunset arrived. Light itself represented status. Abigail watched Lydia carefully throughout supper. The woman spoke with unusual calmness, like someone accustomed to long solitude. She carried stories from distant towns, describing crowded inns, frozen rivers, and travelers trapped by storms farther north. Then Nathaniel asked an ordinary question. "Family waiting for you in Concord." For a brief moment, Lydia's expression changed. "No," she answered quietly. "Not anymore." Silence followed. Colonial Americans understood grief intimately because death touched nearly every household. Disease, accidents, childbirth, weather, and violence claimed lives constantly. Many travelers on winter roads carried personal tragedies behind their silence. Margaret gently changed the subject afterward. Later, once the younger boys slept near the hearth, Abigail helped Lydia unpack blankets beside the fire. Upstairs rooms remained too cold for guests during severe weather. "You travel alone often?" Abigail asked. "More than most women should," Lydia answered with a faint laugh. "Aren't you afraid?" Lydia looked toward the dark windows, where snow still swirled outside. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but loneliness frightens me more." That sentence lingered in Abigail's mind long after. Night settled heavily around the farmhouse. Nathaniel secured the door again, while Margaret extinguished extra candles to save wax. Only the beeswax flame remained glowing softly beside the fire. Outside, wind moved endlessly across frozen fields. Then, sometime deep into the night, Abigail awoke suddenly. The room remained dim. For several confused seconds, she listened carefully. Everyone else still seemed asleep. Then she noticed movement near the fireplace. Lydia sat awake alone, staring into the flames. The older woman appeared almost motionless, except for her hands folded quietly in her lap. Firelight illuminated one side of her face, while the other remained hidden in shadow. Abigail hesitated before whispering softly, "Can't sleep." Lydia turned slowly. Storm too loud. Abigail listened. Wind whistled through cracks in the walls, while branches scratched the roof overhead. "I like storms sometimes," Abigail admitted. Lydia smiled gently. "So did my daughter." Something painful flickered briefly across her expression. Abigail moved closer beside the fire. "What happened to her?" For a long moment, Lydia said nothing. Then finally she answered, "Fever 3 winters ago." Abigail lowered her eyes immediately. Entire families disappeared from illness during those years. Fevers swept through towns unpredictably, especially during harsh winters when travel became impossible and doctors remained far away. Lydia stared into the flames again. She was 11, she whispered. Loved the sound of snow against windows. The fire cracked softly between them. Outside, darkness covered the countryside completely. Nighttime conversations before electricity often carried unusual intimacy because darkness removed distractions. Families, travelers, and strangers spoke more openly beside candlelight than they might during busy daylight hours. Abigail eventually asked another question. "Is that why you travel?" Lydia considered carefully. "Partly," she paused. Staying still became difficult after she died. Abigail did not fully understand grief yet, but she understood silence. The farmhouse suddenly felt smaller around them, while snowstorms pressed against the windows. Then Lydia spoke again. "Do you know what people miss most about the old nights?" "The old nights, before towns grew louder." Lydia glanced toward the candle. "People used to listen more carefully." Abigail frowned slightly. "To what?" "The world." The older woman leaned back slowly. People knew the sound of weather changing. They recognized animal calls, They noticed footsteps outside long before danger reached the door. Darkness sharpened everything. Abigail listened quietly. Lydia's voice lowered further. But now cities stay awake later. Taverns stay bright longer. Merchants chase more hours for work. Folks don't sleep the same anymore. In truth, America during the late 18th century was already changing rapidly. Cities expanded. Commerce increased. Artificial lighting slowly improved. Wealthier households extended evening activities later into the night. The ancient rhythm of sleep shaped entirely by sunset. And sunrise was beginning to weaken. Lydia stared at the fire thoughtfully. "One day," she murmured, "people may turn night into something almost like day itself." Abigail laughed softly at the impossible idea. No one could make that much light. Lydia smiled faintly, but said nothing. Hours later, Abigail finally drifted back to sleep near the warm fireplace, while storm winds continued howling outside. Then, just before dawn, Nathaniel woke abruptly. At first, he could not understand what disturbed him. The room remained quiet. The fire had burned low. Snow still covered the windows. Then he noticed something strange. The front door stood slightly open. Cold wind drifted silently into the farmhouse, and Lydia Whitmore was gone. Nathaniel stood instantly. Cold air swept across the farmhouse floor, while the dying fire struggled weakly against the draft coming through the half-open door. Snowflakes drifted inside, melting slowly on the wooden boards. Margaret woke beside the hearth almost immediately. "What happened?" Nathaniel grabbed the lantern. "The woman's gone." Abigail sat upright beneath her blanket, while the younger boys still slept heavily nearby. For a moment, nobody moved. The room felt strangely empty without Lydia's quiet presence near the fire. Nathaniel stepped toward the doorway and peered outside into the pale darkness before dawn. The storm had finally weakened. Snow covered the yard in smooth, untouched layers, except for one narrow trail of footprints leading away from the farmhouse road. Margaret wrapped a shawl tightly around herself. She left before sunrise. Nathaniel frowned deeply. "Looks that way." Abigail glanced around the room. Suddenly, the candles. Margaret turned quickly toward the table. The small bundle of beeswax candles still rested exactly where Lydia had placed them. Nothing else appeared missing. Yet something about the departure unsettled everyone. Nathaniel muttered quietly, "No traveler leaves before dawn after a storm unless they're desperate to keep moving." He lifted the lantern higher and stepped outside. The cold struck immediately. Snow reached nearly to his boots, while weak gray light slowly gathered across the distant horizon. Lydia's broken cart remained beside the barn, exactly where it had been left, but the horse was gone. Nathaniel followed the footprints cautiously through the snow. They curved around the stable, crossed the frozen field, and disappeared onto the narrow road leading east. No sign of Lydia remained beyond that. He stood silently for several moments, listening to the strange stillness that often follows winter storms. The world felt muffled beneath heavy snow. No birds yet sang. No wagons rattled along the road. Only distant wind moved across empty fields. When Nathaniel returned inside, Abigail immediately spoke. Why would she leave like that? Nathaniel removed snow from his boots slowly. Some people get used to moving. Margaret looked unconvinced. She seemed troubled. The family resumed their morning routines quietly. Yet Lydia's absence lingered strangely over the farmhouse. Abigail kept remembering the woman's words beside the fire. People used to listen more carefully. All day long, the sentence echoed in her mind. Outside, sunlight finally broke through clouds for the first time in days. The frozen countryside sparkled brilliantly beneath fresh snow, while smoke rose from scattered chimneys across neighboring farms. Nathaniel spent much of the afternoon repairing tools inside the barn. Around midday, Thomas Reed arrived on horseback carrying supplies from town. "You hear?" Thomas called while dismounting. "Hear what?" "Old Whitmore Place burned down last autumn." Nathaniel paused. "Whitmore?" Thomas nodded. Widow and daughter lived there alone near Concord. Fever took the girl first. Fire took the house months later. Nathaniel stared at him carefully. "What widow?" "Lydia Whitmore." Silence settled between them. Thomas continued speaking while brushing snow from his coat. Folks said she started wandering after losing the girl. Barely stayed anywhere more than a night or two. Nathaniel said nothing. Something about hearing, Lydia described aloud, made the previous night feel heavier somehow. Thomas lowered his voice slightly. "Some people claim she talks to herself now." Nathaniel glanced toward the farmhouse window, where Abigail stood inside. "People say many things during winter." Still, after Thomas left, Nathaniel found himself staring eastward down the road, long after the horse disappeared. That evening darkness returned clear and bitterly cold. Without storm clouds, stars emerged brilliantly overhead. Abigail stepped outside briefly before supper, just to look upward. The sky amazed her every time. Modern people rarely understand how overwhelming the night sky once appeared. Before electricity filled towns with artificial brightness, stars dominated human experience after sunset. Children grew up memorizing constellations. Sailors crossed oceans guided by them. Farmers measured seasons beneath them. Abigail could see thousands. The Milky Way stretched across the heavens like pale smoke. She suddenly remembered Isaiah's dream from far away, though she did not know him at all. A river full of stars. Across America, countless people stared upward nightly at the same sky, while living entirely different lives beneath it. In Virginia, Isaiah worked late repairing fence posts under moonlight alongside several other enslaved men. Harvest preparations had already begun earlier than usual, forcing longer hours despite winter cold. The plantation owner rode between fields carrying a lantern, while workers continued labor long after sunset. Fatigue hung over everyone. One older man quietly muttered, "Night ain't meant for work." Isaiah understood the bitterness immediately. Before widespread artificial lighting, nighttime traditionally represented rest for most ordinary laborers. But wealthy landowners and merchants increasingly pushed against natural limits. Whenever profit demanded more hours, moonlight became another tool for labor. Torches extended exhaustion deeper into darkness. Isaiah hammered frozen wood silently, while frost gathered along his sleeves. Nearby, another worker named Josiah stumbled from tiredness. "You all right?" Isaiah whispered. Josiah nodded weakly, just seeing shadows move. That happened often after long nighttime work. Exhaustion blurred the senses. Flickering torchlight distorted movement strangely. Many workers described seeing shapes in darkness that vanished upon closer inspection. Sleep deprivation haunted early America more than many historians realize. Mothers woke repeatedly tending fires through winter nights. Guards patrolled until dawn. Sailors worked brutal overnight shifts. Farmers rose before sunrise regardless of weather. And countless people experienced interrupted, segmented sleep that modern schedules later erased almost completely. That night, Isaiah finally returned to the cabin long after midnight. Most others collapsed asleep immediately, but Ruth remained awake near the fireplace. "You're wearing yourself into the grave," she whispered. Isaiah sat heavily beside her. "Don't got much choice." Ruth stared into the fire quietly. "They're changing the night," she murmured. Isaiah frowned slightly. "What you mean?" "When I was young, darkness belonged to rest." Her voice sounded distant. "Now they want every hour." Outside, plantation dogs barked somewhere far away. Isaiah leaned back against the wall, exhausted. Ruth suddenly spoke again. "You ever notice dreams disappear when people stop sleeping proper?" He glanced toward her. "You think dreams matter that much?" She nodded slowly. "Dreams remind folks they still human." The fire crackled softly between them. Meanwhile, in New York City, Benjamin Reeves discovered similar changes unfolding around him. Wealthy merchants increasingly demanded newspapers printed faster and later into the night. Taverns remained crowded deeper into darkness than ever before. New oil lamps appeared along certain streets, allowing businesses to stay open longer. Benjamin hated it. One freezing evening, he left the print shop near midnight and found construction workers installing additional street lanterns near the harbor district. A supervisor proudly announced, "City becoming modern." Benjamin stared at the glowing lamps. The word modern felt strange to him. For most of human history, darkness had represented something permanent and untouchable. Yet, Now people behaved as though night itself were merely an inconvenience waiting to be conquered. He continued walking home through icy streets. Near the docks, sailors crowded around fires beside warehouses, unloading cargo from a late arriving ship. Lanterns swung overhead while workers shouted across the darkness. Years earlier, such labor would have waited until sunrise. Now commerce pushed onward through the night. Benjamin passed a tavern where music and laughter spilled into the street. Inside, dozens of candles illuminated drunken faces through smoky windows. The city no longer slept the way older generations remembered. Yet despite all the extra light, darkness still lingered everywhere beyond the brightest streets. One wrong turn still led into dangerous alleys where thieves waited patiently in shadow. As Benjamin crossed a narrow lane near his apartment, he suddenly heard footsteps behind him. Slow, measured, he quickened his pace slightly. The footsteps matched him. Benjamin's hand tightened around the small knife hidden beneath his coat. Another lesson Americans learned before electricity was simple. Darkness always concealed someone. He turned sharply. A man stood several yards away beneath weak lantern glow. The stranger wore a heavy coat and broad hat that hid most of his face. For several tense seconds, neither moved. Then finally, the man spoke. "Evening." Benjamin relaxed, only slightly. "Bit late for walking." The stranger smiled faintly. "Nights growing busier every year." Then he simply continued past, without another word. Benjamin watched him disappear into darkness between buildings. Something about the encounter unsettled him deeply, though he could not explain why. When he finally reached his apartment room above a bakery, he stood by the window, staring across New York's dim nighttime streets. Lanterns flickered. Smoke drifted above rooftops. Voices echoed faintly through cold air. The city remained awake long past midnight, and somewhere far beyond those crowded streets, countless Americans still slept beside fireplaces beneath vast silent skis, clinging to an older world where darkness continued ruling human life. Benjamin Reeves slept poorly after the strange encounter in the alley. The man's final sentence lingered inside his mind long after dawn arrived. Nights growing busier every year. By morning, New York City already roared with activity again. Horses clattered across muddy streets, while dock workers shouted beside the harbor. Bakers pulled fresh bread from ovens before sunrise, and merchants opened storefront shutters to begin another day of trade. Benjamin leaned from his apartment window, holding a cup of bitter coffee. The city smelled alive. Smoke, salt water, wet wood, livestock, and sewage drifted together through the cold air. Below him, laborers unloaded barrels, while newspaper boys raced between wagons shouting headlines into the morning crowd. It amazed Benjamin sometimes how quickly America was changing. When he was a child, evenings in Connecticut had ended almost completely after sunset. Families gathered beside fireplaces, roads emptied, and darkness settled peacefully across the countryside. But New York now resisted sleep itself. Taverns stayed open later every year. Ships arrived at all hours. Wealthy merchants demanded faster communication, longer working hours, and brighter streets. Even the night watchmen complained. They barely recognized the city anymore. Later that afternoon, Benjamin visited the harbor district, delivering printed notices to a shipping office. Thick gray clouds rolled above the water, while gulls circled noisily overhead. Near the docks, workers were installing larger oil lamps along the busiest streets. One merchant proudly explained the improvements to nearby businessmen. Safer for commerce, he declared. Customers stay out later when streets remain lit. Another man laughed. Soon we'll work all night, same as London. Benjamin kept walking silently, but the words bothered him. All night. For most ordinary Americans, nighttime still represented rest, storytelling, prayer, intimacy, and sleep. Yet growing cities increasingly viewed darkness as wasted opportunity. Money was beginning to reshape human rhythm itself. Meanwhile, far from New York's crowded streets, the Parker family prepared for another brutal winter evening in Massachusetts. Snow covered the fields so deeply now that fences barely remained visible. Nathaniel spent most of the day chopping extra firewood, while Abigail helped Margaret preserve dried apples and salted meat inside the pantry. The younger boys complained constantly about boredom. You'd beg for quiet come summer harvest, Nathaniel warned. But winter confinement affected many colonial families emotionally. Long, dark evenings trapped people indoors for weeks at a time. Cabin fever, loneliness, irritability, and sadness became common companions during severe winters. Abigail sometimes felt the darkness pressing against the farmhouse long before sunset even arrived. That evening, while Margaret stirred soup above the fire, Abigail finally asked the question still lingering in her thoughts. Do you think Lydia was lonely? Nathaniel looked up from repairing a harness strap. Most travelers are. No, Abigail replied softly. I mean truly lonely. Margaret paused her cooking briefly. The room fell quiet, except for the bubbling pot. Then Nathaniel answered carefully. There's different kinds of loneliness. Abigail waited. Some people miss company, he continued. Others miss who they used to be. The fire cracked loudly. Abigail remembered Lydia staring into the flames after midnight while speaking about her daughter. Suddenly, the older woman's wandering made more sense. Before electricity, nights gave people enormous time for reflection because darkness removed distraction. Once work ended and candles dimmed, thoughts grew louder. Grief often felt heavier beside midnight fires than during busy daylight hours. That was why storytelling mattered so much. Conversation protected people from silence. Later, after supper ended, Nathaniel surprised the children by pulling an old wooden box from beneath his bed. Dust covered the lid. "What's that?" the youngest boy asked excitedly. Nathaniel smiled faintly. "My father's clock." The children gathered immediately. Inside rested a tall brass pocket watch attached to a worn leather strap. The metal looked dark with age, but when Nathaniel carefully wound it, soft ticking filled the room. Abigail stared in fascination. "You never use it." "Needs repair," Nathaniel answered. "Loses time badly." Time itself felt different before electricity standardized modern schedules. Many rural Americans measured days loosely through sunlight, church bells, roosters, and seasonal habits rather than precise clocks. People woke at dawn, ate when hungry, and slept according to darkness. Nathaniel held the ticking watch thoughtfully. "My father said watches would someday rule people's lives." The younger boys laughed at the strange idea. How could a watch rule anyone? Nathaniel only smiled. But history was already moving exactly that direction. Factories, shipping companies, newspapers, and expanding cities increasingly demanded precise timing. Sleep schedules slowly became stricter as industrial life developed. The old natural rhythms of first sleep and second sleep would not survive forever. Outside, darkness settled fully over the farm. Margaret lit only 2 candles that evening to conserve wax. Their small flames illuminated the room weakly, while cold shadows filled every corner beyond the firelight. Then suddenly, Abigail noticed something. The ticking clock sounded incredibly loud. Tick, tick, tick. In modern homes, constant electric noise masks tiny sounds. But colonial nights remained quiet enough for clocks, wind, footsteps, and breathing to dominate entire rooms. Abigail listened carefully. Tick, tick. It almost sounded like another heartbeat inside the house. Nathaniel eventually tucked the clock away again, while Margaret prepared blankets for sleep. Snow brushed softly against the windows outside. Then the younger boy whispered nervously, "Tell another story." Margaret sighed with amusement. "You boys never tire of stories. They help sleeping." That simple truth connected generations across early America. Stories eased fear of darkness, especially for children. Ghost tales, legends, religious parables, and family memories filled long evenings beside the fire. Nathaniel began speaking quietly about his grandfather, surviving a terrible winter storm decades earlier. The children listened closely while flames danced across the room. Outside, night deepened, and somewhere many miles south, another family gathered around another fire, hearing another story beneath the same stars. In Virginia, Isaiah sat outside the cabin briefly after finishing evening labor. The cold air felt sharp inside his lungs, but he welcomed the silence after endless hours in the fields. Above him, The sky looked enormous. Ruth joined him, slowly carrying a wool blanket around her shoulders. "You should sleep," Isaiah told her gently. "Sleep comes when it wants." They sat quietly together, listening to distant plantation sounds. A horse snorted near the stable. Chains rattled faintly. Someone coughed inside another cabin. Then silence returned again. Ruth pointed upward suddenly. "You know those stars?" Isaiah shrugged. "Some. My father knew everyone." Her voice carried memory and sadness together. "Said our people crossed deserts guided by them long before ships carried us here." Isaiah looked upward more carefully. For enslaved communities, nighttime often carried emotional importance beyond simple rest. Darkness created rare moments where culture, memory, songs, and stories survived away from constant supervision. Ruth smiled faintly. Night remembers things daytime tries to erase. Isaiah remained silent. Then she added quietly, "That's why some folks fear darkness. Not because it hides things, because it reveals them." Far away in Pennsylvania, Samuel Holt experienced a far more unsettling night. The storm had finally passed, leaving the forest unnaturally still beneath moonlight. Samuel sat alone beside the fireplace after Daniel Mercer departed earlier that morning toward Philadelphia. The cabin felt emptier now. He sharpened traps silently, while wind moved through distant trees. Then suddenly, the dogs outside began growling. Samuel froze. The growls deepened, low, uneasy. He reached for the rifle immediately. Frontier settlers trusted animal behavior deeply because dogs often sensed approaching strangers or predators long before humans noticed danger. Samuel stepped carefully toward the window. Moonlight covered the clearing in pale silver. At first, he saw nothing unusual. Then movement appeared near the trees. A lantern, dim and distant. Samuel frowned. Another lantern emerged farther behind it. Then another. 3 separate lights, drifting silently between snow-covered pines. Exactly as Daniel Mercer described. Samuel opened the cabin door cautiously. Cold air rushed inside. The lanterns continued moving slowly through the forest without approaching closer. No voices accompanied them. No horses. No visible travelers. Only floating lights, weaving silently among the trees. Samuel felt genuine fear for the first time in years. He raised the rifle slightly. Then one by one, the lanterns vanished behind the snowfall. Gone completely. The dogs stopped growling immediately afterward. Samuel remained standing outside for several long moments, staring into the dark forest. Nothing moved anymore. Only moonlight touched the snow. Yet when he finally returned inside and locked the cabin door firmly behind him, he could not shake the terrible feeling that someone or something had been watching from the woods beyond the firelight and across America as another long night stretched onward before electricity. Millions of people drifted between sleep and wakefulness, while darkness kept its ancient secrets hidden just beyond the glow of every candle flame. Samuel Holt barely slept after seeing the lanterns in the forest. Each time he closed his eyes, he pictured those silent lights weaving between the snow-covered trees beyond his cabin. By dawn, the fire had burned low, and exhaustion sat heavily behind his eyes. Still, morning chores waited. Frontier life allowed little time for fear. Samuel stepped outside carrying a bucket toward the frozen creek, while pale sunlight filtered through the pines. Snow creaked beneath his boots. The forest looked perfectly ordinary again, almost peaceful, as if the strange lanterns had never existed at all. That unsettled him even more. Many Americans living near wilderness understood this feeling well. Forests could appear calm during daylight, yet become deeply unnerving after sunset. Darkness transformed familiar landscapes into unfamiliar territory. Trees became figures. Shadows moved unexpectedly. Sounds carried strangely through cold air. Samuel knelt beside the frozen creek, breaking ice carefully with an axe. Then he noticed tracks nearby. Not animal tracks, boot prints, several of them fresh. He straightened immediately and scanned the trees. Nothing moved. The tracks disappeared deeper into the woods beyond sight. Samuel stared at them silently. Perhaps travelers passed during the night. Perhaps hunters. Yet something about the tracks disturbed him because no roads existed nearby. Few people wandered these forests after dark, unless absolutely necessary. He returned to the cabin uneasy. Inside, the remaining warmth from the fireplace barely chased away the cold clinging to the walls. Samuel loaded fresh powder into his rifle more carefully than usual. Then he laughed softly at himself. "You're growing old and foolish," he muttered aloud. But even experienced frontiersmen carried superstitions. Isolation and darkness shaped the human mind in powerful ways. Meanwhile, in New York City, Benjamin Reeves stumbled through another exhausting overnight shift inside the print shop. Candle smoke filled the cramped room, while metal press parts groaned endlessly beside him. The apprentices looked half asleep. One boy accidentally dropped an entire tray of letters across the floor. Benjamin sighed heavily. "Slow down before you ruin tomorrow's edition." The boy rubbed his burning eyes. "Feels like midnight never ends anymore." Benjamin glanced toward the window. Outside, the city still moved despite the late hour. Tavern lanterns flickered. Wagons rattled near the harbor. Sailors shouted drunken songs somewhere beyond the alleyways. He remembered how his father once described nighttime. Quiet, dark, still. New York no longer resembled that world. The printing business changed rapidly because growing cities demanded constant information. Merchants wanted shipping news immediately. Political debates spread through newspapers overnight. Printers increasingly worked until dawn to satisfy expanding commerce. Benjamin sometimes wondered whether people themselves were changing because of it. Americans had once slept according to darkness. Now darkness itself seemed under attack. Near 2 o'clock in the morning, Benjamin finally stepped outside for air again. Snow from previous days had turned gray and muddy beneath wagon wheels. Clouds covered the stars completely tonight. The city felt strangely restless. As he walked toward a nearby tavern for coffee, he passed groups of laborers unloading cargo beneath lantern light at the docks. Their faces looked hollow from fatigue. One older worker muttered angrily while carrying crates. "Sun ain't enough anymore for these rich men." Another laughed bitterly. "Soon they'll have us digging ditches at midnight too." Benjamin kept walking silently, but the words stayed with him. In truth, ordinary people across America already sensed enormous changes happening around them, even if they lacked words to describe it fully. Work expanded deeper into evenings. Cities grew brighter. Sleep patterns slowly shifted. The ancient boundary between day and night weakened year by year. Far south in Charleston, a leaner finch experienced those changes from another angle entirely. Her father now hosted evening business gatherings several times each month, inviting merchants and ship captains into their home long after sunset. Wealthy Americans increasingly treated nighttime as social opportunity rather than simple rest. Tonight, the Finch house glowed brilliantly with dozens of candles. Servants hurried between rooms carrying silver trays, while music drifted softly through the halls. Men discussed trade routes beside the fireplace, while women in elegant dresses laughed beneath warm golden light. Alina stood near the staircase, watching quietly. She found the gatherings beautiful, but exhausting. The rooms grew hot from candle flames and crowded bodies. Smoke from fireplaces mixed with perfume and wine until the air felt heavy. By midnight, many guests looked pale with tiredness despite pretending otherwise. Her aunt approached, holding a glass of wine. "You should enjoy yourself more." Alina smiled politely. "I prefer quieter evenings." Her aunt laughed softly. "You sound like an old widow already." But Alina secretly missed darker nights. As a child, she often sat beside windows watching moonlight over the harbor in silence. Now music, conversation, and candlelight filled every corner of the house during gatherings. Even midnight no longer felt mysterious. Her father proudly claimed Charleston was becoming more modern each year. Alina was not entirely certain that was good. Later, after most guests departed, servants extinguished candles room by room. Darkness returned gradually through the enormous house. Alina walked alone toward the upstairs hallway, carrying a small lantern. Then she heard it. Piano music, soft and distant. She stopped immediately. Everyone else had retired for the night. The music floated faintly from downstairs. A slow, melancholy melody. Alina descended carefully. The lantern trembled slightly in her hand. Downstairs, the ballroom remained almost completely dark, except for moonlight spilling through tall windows. Chairs stood empty. Candle smoke still lingered faintly in the air, and beside the piano sat her father alone, playing softly. Alina froze in surprise, because she had never once seen him touch the instrument before. He looked older somehow in the moonlight, tired. When the song ended, he noticed her standing there. For several moments, neither spoke. Then finally, he smiled faintly. Couldn't sleep. Alina stepped closer carefully. What song was that? Her father stared down at the piano keys. Your mother used to play it. A strange sadness filled the room suddenly. Alina's mother had died years earlier from fever. Yet her father almost never mentioned her aloud. He touched the piano gently. House gets too loud sometimes, he admitted quietly. Hard to hear memories anymore. Alina understood then. Even wealthy Americans, embracing brighter nights, occasionally missed the older darkness they once knew. Meanwhile, back in Massachusetts, Abigail Parker woke naturally during the middle of the night once again. Segmented sleep still shaped many rural families. People often rested for several hours, woke quietly around midnight, then returned to sleep later toward dawn. Abigail sat beside the fire, wrapped in blankets, while the rest of the family slept nearby. The farmhouse felt peaceful. She listened carefully to the nighttime sounds Lydia Whitmore once described. Wind touching the roof, fire crackling softly, a horse shifting in the stable outside, the distant cry of an owl. Darkness no longer frightened Abigail quite as much as before. Instead, she began noticing how alive the night truly sounded once a person listened carefully enough. Then she heard another sound. Footsteps outside. Abigail stiffened immediately, slow crunching through snow near the barn. She almost woke Nathaniel instantly, but hesitated. The footsteps continued, then stopped completely. Abigail held her breath. Silence returned. For several long moments, she sat frozen beside the dying fire. Finally, curiosity overcame fear. She moved carefully toward the window and peered outside into moonlit snow. At first, she saw nothing. Then near the edge of the field, barely visible beneath pale moonlight, stood a figure, motionless, watching the farmhouse. Abigail's heart pounded violently. The figure appeared tall and dark against the snow. Then suddenly, it moved away toward the trees, gone within seconds. Abigail stumbled backward from the window. Nathaniel woke immediately at the sound. What is it? There's someone outside, she whispered breathlessly. Nathaniel grabbed the rifle beside the hearth and hurried toward the door. Cold air burst inside as he stepped into the moonlit yard. Snow glittered silver beneath the stars. The fields stretched empty in every direction. No figure remained anywhere. Only one thing disturbed the untouched snow: footprints leading toward the road east, the same direction Lydia Whitmore had traveled days earlier. Nathaniel followed the footprints only a short distance before stopping near the edge of the frozen field. Moonlight covered the countryside in pale silver, making every shadow appear deeper than it truly was. The tracks continued eastward toward the narrow road, disappearing between dark trees. But whoever made them was already gone. Cold wind moved across the snow, while the farmhouse glowed faintly behind him. Nathaniel tightened his grip on the rifle and listened carefully. Nothing, no voices, no horses, only distant branches creaking in the night. After several minutes, he finally returned inside where Abigail still waited beside the fire, pale and wide-eyed beneath the flickering light. "You see anyone?" Margaret asked quietly after waking. Nathaniel shook his head. "Just tracks." Abigail wrapped the blanket tighter around herself. There was definitely somebody standing there. Nathaniel placed another log onto the fire before answering. Probably traveler cutting across the fields, but his voice lacked certainty. The younger boys remained asleep through the entire commotion, while the adults stayed awake much longer afterward. That was another hidden reality of life before electricity. Nights rarely passed uninterrupted. Strange noises, storms, crying children, sick relatives, wandering animals, and unexpected visitors constantly disturbed sleep. People became accustomed to fragmented rest. Margaret eventually whispered softly, "Maybe we should keep the lantern burning till dawn." Nathaniel glanced toward the nearly empty oil container beside the hearth. "Can't waste it every night. Light cost money. Darkness cost comfort." Every household balanced the two carefully. Abigail lay back down eventually, but sleep returned slowly. She kept imagining the silent figure watching the farmhouse from the field. Yet, beneath the fear, another feeling existed too: curiosity. Who walked alone through snow after midnight? And why did the footprints always lead eastward, far away in Pennsylvania? Samuel Holt experienced another unsettling evening inside his isolated cabin. He spent the day checking trap lines deeper in the forest. Hopping physical labor would erase thoughts about the mysterious lanterns. Instead, he discovered even stranger signs. Near one frozen ridge, he found ashes from a recent fire hidden beneath snow. Not old ashes, fresh. Someone had camped nearby within the last day or two. Samuel crouched beside the remains silently. No roads passed through that area. Hunters rarely ventured there during winter because game grew scarce. Yet, clear boot prints surrounded the ashes before disappearing among the trees. He returned home before sunset, feeling increasingly uneasy. The cabin no longer felt as safe as before. As darkness settled across the wilderness, Samuel secured the door carefully. and loaded both rifles within easy reach of the fireplace. Outside, the forest disappeared into blackness almost immediately after sunset. Frontier nights carried overwhelming darkness. Without nearby towns or lantern-lit roads, wilderness regions became nearly impossible to navigate after dusk. Moonlight helped somewhat during clear weather, but clouds could erase visibility completely. Samuel sat listening to the woods, while wind moved through distant pines. Then, sometime after midnight, the dogs growled again. Low, threatening, Samuel slowly lifted the lantern. The cabin walls creaked softly in the cold. Another sound followed. A knock, not on the door, on the window. Samuel's blood turned cold instantly. Nobody approached frontier cabins at night unless desperate or dangerous. The knock came again. Slow, deliberate. Samuel raised the rifle and stepped carefully toward the window. Frost covered most of the glass, making visibility nearly impossible. "Who's there?" he shouted. Silence. Then finally, a voice answered from outside. "Need warmth." The voice sounded weak, human, exhausted. Samuel hesitated. Frontier hospitality often saved lives, but it also killed careless settlers. Bandits occasionally used injured travelers to lure victims into opening doors. The voice spoke again. "Please." Samuel finally lifted the lantern higher and scraped frost away from part of the window. A young woman stood outside wrapped in heavy blankets, her face pale from cold. Beside her waited no horse, no wagon, no companions, only darkness behind her. Samuel opened the door cautiously. The woman nearly collapsed, entering the cabin. "You alone?" he demanded. She nodded weakly. "Lost my horse yesterday." Samuel studied her carefully, while she warmed trembling hands near the fire. Something about her clothing suggested wealthier origins than most frontier travelers. "What's your name? Where you headed?" She swallowed slowly. "West." That single word explained almost nothing. Thousands of Americans traveled westward during those years, chasing land, opportunity, escape, or reinvention. The frontier attracted dreamers, fugitives, widows, debtors, adventurers, and people simply desperate for change. Samuel handed her stew silently. Then he noticed something strange. Around neck hung a small brass pocket watch. Its ticking sounded unnaturally loud inside the quiet cabin. Tick, tick, tick. The same sound Abigail Parker noticed inside her farmhouse days earlier. Caught Samuel staring. "It belonged to my father," she explained softly. Samuel nodded slowly, but kept listening to the ticking. Outside, darkness pressed tightly around the cabin walls. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles south in Virginia, Isaiah experienced a very different kind of nighttime fear. A young enslaved boy named Eli had disappeared shortly after sunset. By midnight, Lanterns moved across the plantation fields, while overseers searched furiously through the darkness. Dogs barked wildly near the riverbanks. Workers gathered outside cabins, whispering nervously. Children disappearing at night terrified enslaved communities because possibilities were endless and terrible. The boy might be hiding, injured, freezing somewhere alone, or captured while attempting escape. Isaiah joined several men searching near the woods, carrying smoky torches. Branches scratched against their coats, while frozen ground cracked beneath boots. Eli, someone shouted repeatedly into darkness. No answer came. The plantation owner rode nearby, holding a lantern high above his horse. His anger frightened everyone, almost as much as the disappearance itself. Hours passed. Then finally, one of the dogs began barking near the river. The searchers hurried toward the sound. They found Eli sitting beneath a tree wrapped in blankets, half asleep but unharmed. Relief spread instantly through the group. Isaiah knelt beside the boy gently. "What were you doing out here?" Eli looked confused and frightened. "I heard singing." The adults exchanged uneasy glances. "What singing?" The child pointed toward the dark river. Voices. Many enslaved communities carried spiritual traditions involving nighttime songs, ancestral voices, and supernatural warnings. Children especially often interpreted ordinary nighttime sounds through those beliefs. But Isaiah noticed something unsettling. The boy's footprints showed no wandering pattern. He had walked directly from the cabins to the tree, as though following something intentionally. Back at the cabins, Ruth listened carefully after hearing the story. Then she whispered softly to Isaiah later that night. Night calls differently to some people. Isaiah frowned. You think he heard real voices? Ruth stared into the fire. Maybe memory sounds like voices when darkness gets deep enough. Far north again in New York City, Benjamin Reeves finally collapsed into bed near dawn after another brutal shift at the print shop. Exhaustion blurred his thoughts constantly now. Yet despite his tiredness, sleep refused to come immediately. Noise drifted endlessly through the city outside. Wagons, shouting, dogs barking, drunken arguments, harbor bells. Cities before electricity were darker than modern ones, but rarely truly silent. Crowded urban life produced constant disturbances that made uninterrupted rest difficult. Benjamin rolled onto his side, frustrated. Then he noticed something strange, a glow outside his window. He sat upright carefully. Across the street, workers were testing a newly installed oil before sunrise. The flame burned steadily against the darkness, brighter than older lanterns Benjamin remembered from childhood. One worker proudly adjusted the metal frame. Another laughed loudly. Soon these'll line every street. Benjamin stared silently at the artificial glow. The lamp pushed darkness farther back than older lights ever could. For a moment, he imagined entire cities illuminated all night long. The thought felt impossible, and yet somehow inevitable. He finally lay back down listening to the distant sounds of workers celebrating progress outside, while dawn slowly approached the crowded city. Across America, some people still slept beneath vast, untouched darkness, while others already watched the night itself begin changing forever. Winter slowly loosened its grip across the colonies, but the long nights still carried cold deep into the early spring months. Snow melted unevenly along roads, while rivers swelled with dark rushing water beneath gray skis. Across farms, cities, plantations, forests, and harbors, Americans continued living between two worlds, the old world ruled by firelight and stars, and the new world slowly learning how to push darkness away. For Abigail Parker, the strange figure near the field remained impossible to forget. Weeks had passed since that night, yet sometimes she still woke during the middle hours before dawn and stared toward the window, expecting another silhouette to appear against the snow. None ever did, but the feeling remained. The night was watching. One chilly evening near the beginning of spring, returned from town, carrying more news than supplies. His boots were thick with mud from thawing roads, while his coat smelled of rain and horse sweat. Immediately noticed his expression. What happened? Removed his gloves slowly before answering. Town's changing. He sat heavily beside the fire, while Abigail poured warm cider for him. They're installing more lamps near the main roads, he continued. Merchants want shops open later. Frowned slightly. Later than sunset. Nodded. Much later. The younger boys looked excited by the idea. But Abigail noticed something uneasy in her father's voice. What's wrong with that? She asked softly, stared into the fire. When nights disappear, people forget how to rest. Silence settled across the farmhouse. Outside, rain tapped softly against the roof, while distant frogs sang from swollen marshes. Spring nights carried different sounds than winter. The world slowly awakened again after months of stillness, yet darkness still shaped every household. Candles remained precious. Lanterns remained weak. Most families still gathered around fireplaces once the sun vanished. But change had begun. Far away in New York City, Benjamin Reeves saw those changes every night now. New oil lamps lined several streets near the harbor, allowing businesses to stay open deeper into darkness than ever before. The city no longer truly slept. Benjamin stood outside the print shop one evening watching crowds move beneath the glowing lamps. Merchants laughed outside taverns. Sailors wandered drunkenly between docks. Street vendors sold food near midnight, as if evening had become another afternoon. The artificial light fascinated people. Children gathered beneath lamps, simply to read after dark. Couples walked later than older generations ever considered proper. Businessmen celebrated the possibility of endless productivity. But Benjamin noticed another consequence too. People looked exhausted. Workers stumbled home near dawn with hollow eyes. Apprentices slept beside crates during deliveries. Tavern owners barely rested at all anymore. More light had not brought more peace. It had only stretched the day longer. One night, an older printer named Wallace joined Benjamin outside during a short break. "You ever miss darkness?" Wallace asked suddenly. Benjamin looked surprised. "What kind of question is that?" Wallace shrugged. "When I was young, night meant something. Families sat together, streets emptied. People actually slept." Benjamin glanced toward the glowing harbor district. "And now," Wallace gave a tired laugh, "now merchants think candles can defeat human bodies." The older man coughed heavily before returning inside. Benjamin remained staring at the lamps long afterward. Meanwhile, deep in the Pennsylvania wilderness, Samuel Holt prepared for perhaps his final season living alone on the frontier. The strange lantern sightings never fully stopped. Sometimes distant lights still drifted through the trees after midnight before vanishing into darkness. Samuel never discovered whether they belonged to travelers, hunters, smugglers, or simply tricks played by exhaustion and moonlight. But the mystery changed him. He slept less peacefully now, listened more carefully, checked the cabin door twice each night. Clara, the young traveler he rescued weeks earlier, had departed westward after recovering from illness. Yet, before leaving, she told Samuel something that lingered in his thoughts ever since. "Loneliness changes what people see at night," she whispered while preparing her horse. At the time, Samuel dismissed the comment. Now he wondered. Perhaps darkness itself was not frightening. Perhaps solitude inside darkness frightened people most. One evening, Samuel climbed a rocky ridge, overlooking the endless forest as sunset bled red across the horizon. For the first time in years, he imagined leaving the wilderness entirely, not because he feared it, because he no longer wished to face endless nights alone. Below him, the trees stretched like a black ocean toward distant mountains. Soon darkness would swallow every path between them, and somewhere far beyond those forests, cities were already learning how to shine through the night. In Virginia, Isaiah witnessed another kind of transformation. The plantation owner recently purchased larger lanterns imported from Europe. Workers now labored later into the evenings during planting season, while overseers proudly boasted about increased productivity. Ruth hated the new lanterns immediately. "They stealing night itself," she muttered bitterly. Isaiah understood. Darkness once provided small moments of privacy and recovery for enslaved people. Longer working hours meant shorter rest, fewer stories, fewer songs, fewer quiet conversations beside cabin fires. Even dreams seemed thinner lately. One humid night, Isaiah sat outside, staring upward, while clouds drifted across the stars. Eli, the young boy who once followed mysterious singing into the woods, sat beside him quietly. "You think stars ever disappear?" Eli asked suddenly. Isaiah frowned slightly. "What you mean?" The boy pointed toward the plantation house, where larger lanterns now burned late into the evening. "Feels like people making too much light." Isaiah looked upward again. The stars still remained visible here far from cities. Yet he understood the feeling. Lanterns, torches, candles, fires. Humanity kept trying to hold back darkness longer every year. Ruth emerged slowly from the cabin doorway behind them. "My grandmother used to say nights belong to memory," she whispered. "But folks fear remembering." The old woman lowered herself beside them carefully. "One day," she continued softly, "people will fill every darkness with noise, because silence makes them uncomfortable." Isaiah listened quietly, while warm night air moved through the fields. Crickets sang endlessly. Somewhere an owl called through darkness. And for a moment, despite everything, the night still felt ancient and alive. Far south in Charleston, a leaner finch experienced, perhaps, the clearest sign of America's changing nights. Her father hosted another enormous evening gathering inside their glowing townhouse. Candles illuminated every room, while musicians played long past midnight. Merchants discussed trade expansions, factories, and new technologies arriving from Europe. One wealthy businessman proudly announced during supper, "Someday cities may never need darkness at all." The table erupted with fascinated conversation, but Alina noticed something else. Nobody looked toward the windows anymore. As a child, she remembered guests pausing to admire moonlight over the harbor or storms rolling across the sea. Now people focused entirely inward, toward brighter rooms, louder music, longer parties. The outside night no longer mattered to them. Later, unable to sleep, Alina slipped quietly onto the balcony overlooking Charleston Harbor. The city glowed brighter than ever before. Lanterns lined several streets. Ships carried lamps along the docks. Music drifted upward from taverns, still crowded deep into the night. Yet beyond the harbor, far out above the black ocean, darkness still ruled completely. Alina stared toward that vast emptiness, and suddenly understood something important. People were not conquering night. They were only building tiny islands of light inside it. Back in Massachusetts, Abigail Parker experienced her own realization during one final midnight waking. The farmhouse remained silent, except for the steady breathing of her sleeping family. Firelight glowed softly across the room, while rain tapped gently outside. She sat beside the window, watching darkness beyond the fields. No mysterious figure appeared tonight. No footsteps crossed the mud. Only quiet spring rain falling beneath clouds. And yet Abigail no longer feared the night the way she once had. Over months, she had learned its sounds, its rhythms, its silences. Darkness was not empty after all. It carried stories, grief, dreams, memory, loneliness, wonder, and rest. People before electricity understood this deeply because they lived inside the night instead of merely escaping it. Abigail looked toward the dying fire. One day, perhaps, people would illuminate entire cities until midnight resembled afternoon. Perhaps children would grow afraid of silence itself. Perhaps stars would vanish behind endless artificial brightness. But tonight, the farmhouse still belonged to the old world, the world of candle flames, the world of midnight conversations, the world where families gathered close together while darkness breathed softly just beyond the windows. And somewhere across America, millions of others rested beneath that same enormous night, listening to rain, hearing floorboards creak, waking briefly between first sleep and second sleep, and surrendering themselves to darkness the way humanity had done for countless generations before electricity changed everything forever. Across America, the last stretches of the old night lingered quietly, as if the world itself was reluctant to let go of the darkness it had known for centuries. But change was no longer distant. It had arrived. In Boston, the Parker farmhouse sat awake far earlier than dawn on a summer morning. The air was warmer now, carrying the scent of wet earth and growing fields. Birds had already begun calling outside, and the sky showed the faintest trace of blue. Abigail Parker stood at the window, watching something that would have been unimaginable to her grandmother. A new street lamp had been installed at the edge of the nearby road, leading toward town. It burned through the night. Even now, just before sunrise, it still glowed faintly. Nathaniel joined her silently, holding a cup of coffee. They tested it all night, he said. Abigail didn't take her eyes off it. It never went out. Nathaniel shook his head. Oil burns longer than candles, and they keep improving them. Behind them, Margaret stirred bread dough near the hearth, while the younger boys slowly woke. The house felt different now, not because it had changed, but because the world outside had begun refusing to stay dark. That evening, Nathaniel walked to town again. When he returned, he looked older somehow. They've started planting more lamps along the main road, he said quietly. Not just towns anymore, even between towns. Margaret frowned. Why would anyone want that much light? Nathaniel hesitated. So travelers can move at night. Abigail looked up. People travel at night now. Nathaniel nodded slowly. Some do. Silence followed. It was no longer just commerce or convenience. It was expansion. Human life was beginning to stretch into hours that once belonged entirely to sleep. Far away in New York City, Benjamin Reeves stood on a newly lit street long after sunset, watching how the city had transformed again. Where once darkness swallowed entire neighborhoods, rows of oil lamps now burned steadily along major routes. The glow reflected off wet cobblestones, turning the streets into rivers of light. Children no longer hurried home at dusk. Apprentices no longer feared returning late. Even Benjamin's print shop now operated later hours without interruption. But something had changed inside him too. One night, Wallace, the older printer, stood beside him again outside the shop. "You see it too, don't you?" Wallace asked. Benjamin didn't answer immediately. "The night is smaller," Wallace continued. Benjamin finally spoke. "Or we are just refusing to live inside it." Wallace gave a tired smile. Same thing in the end. And then he walked away into the glowing street. Benjamin remained standing there long after, noticing how even the stars above New York seemed fainter than he remembered from childhood. In Pennsylvania, Samuel Holt finally left the wilderness. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but quietly, like a man stepping out of a long dream. He sold his cabin to a trapper heading deeper into the forest and rode east toward growing settlements where lamps already lined certain roads. Before leaving, he stood one last time at the edge of the ridge overlooking the trees. The forest that once felt endless now looked different, not less vast, but less unknown, as if darkness itself had started to lose some of its power. And Samuel realized something he never expected. He no longer feared the night. He simply no longer belonged to it. In Virginia, Isaiah watched another evening end inside the plantation fields. Lanterns now stretched further across the property than before. Work continued later into the night during harvest season. The boundary between labor and rest had become thinner. Ruth, older and weaker now, sat outside the cabin one final time with Isaiah beside her. She looked up at the sky slowly. "They said light would make life easier," she whispered. Isaiah nodded quietly, but it only made it longer. Ruth smiled faintly, and longer days make shorter peace. She closed her eyes gently that night and did not wake again before morning. Isaiah buried her beneath the quiet ground beside the fields, where she had lived most of her life, under both darkness and moonlight. He looked upward afterward. The stars still remained, but for the first time, lantern light from the plantation house stretched far enough that even the shadows around him no longer felt fully separate from human control. Far south in Charleston, a leaner finch stood on her balcony once more. The harbor now glowed brighter than ever. More lamps lined the streets below. More ships carried light, even after midnight. More homes kept candles burning deeper into the night. Her father proudly called it progress, but Alina no longer saw it that way. She watched as darkness retreated further beyond the city each year, pushed outward like something slowly being erased. Then she noticed something small, beyond the brightest edge of Charleston, where lamps no longer reached. The ocean still stretched endlessly into complete darkness, unchanged, unbroken, unlit, and she understood then what no amount of progress could truly change. Light could expand, darkness would always remain. Back in Massachusetts, Abigail Parker woke once more during the middle of the night. But this time, something felt different. She didn't feel fear. She didn't feel confusion. She simply listened. The wind outside moved gently through the fields. The fire inside the farmhouse breathed softly. Her family slept around her in familiar silence. And for the first time in her life, Abigail realized that night was not an enemy waiting outside the window. It was a world of its own, a world people had once lived inside completely, a world they were now slowly stepping out of. She looked toward the faint glow of the distant new lamp on the road, then back at the dying fire. Two kinds of light, two kinds of time, and between them, she understood something simple but vast. Human life was no longer shaped only by the sun. It was being reshaped by what humans themselves created to replace the dark. She lay back down slowly, listening to the farmhouse creak, listening to the night breathe. And as dawn finally began to rise beyond the fields, the old world of segmented sleep, candlelit darkness, midnight wandering thoughts, and star-filled silence did not vanish all at once. It faded slowly, quietly, across generations, like a long dream ending, without anyone noticing the exact moment it disappeared. And somewhere deep inside that fading night, America kept sleeping.